This is the most comprehensive taxi bill in the history of the state. It is creating unprecedented changes. We do need to ensure that we have an industry that drivers can make a fair living in, and also that the public can have confidence in. So I am bringing in legislation which will deliver mandatory disqualifications for criminals with serious convictions. When I talk about serious convictions, I'm talking about murder, manslaughter, rape, terrorism, torture, trafficking, various sexual offences and others. And effectively, I don't believe that people like that should be driving taxis, and this legislation is to empower the Gardaí to ensure that such people aren't behind the wheels of taxis.
How quickly is it going to happen once this legislation is passed?
Well, all legislation has to be proportionate. The legislation is going through the Seanad today, and then it'll go to the Dáil, and it'll have to be signed into law by the President. And from there on in, the legislation is in effect. There is some details with the Gardaí to be worked out with, but there is a requirement to have an appeals process, as in all legislation. Appeals are allowed up to a year. So if somebody is identified that shouldn't be behind the wheel of a taxi, they will have a year to appeal the suspension or the total revocation of that licence by the Gardaí.
I accept the fact that an appeal system is welcome by some, but at the same time, is that not a year that a convicted murderer or a convicted rapist is still behind the wheel of the car, even if they are on notice to the relevant authorities?
Well, Jonathan, they're behind the wheel of the car at the moment. They've been behind the wheel of the car in some cases, for a number of years. I don't believe they should be behind the wheel at all. But I have to take due cognizance of proportionality when it comes to law, and I have to take the Attorney General's advice.
And what happens if something happens in the meantime when you know that there is a murderer or a rapist behind the wheel? I appreciate that this is the first time the government is doing something on this, but what happens if whose conscience is that on?
Well, Jonathan, and already there is legislation in place whereby the Gardaí can identify individuals and say they're not fit and proper persons to be behind the wheel of a taxi. Unfortunately, and I say this really, properly, unfortunately, in some cases, judges have disregarded the Gardaí and have allowed people to maintain their licences so they can make a living. What I am doing through this legislation is enhancing the legislation so that the judiciary have to take account of it, and empowering the Gardaí to take out undesirables who they don't believe should be in the industry. However, we have to respect proportionality, and that's the legal advice we're getting. Furthermore, there's going to be temporary bans for people with firearm offences, serious threats, harassment, violent disorder, false imprisonment, etc., where those people, once they serve their sentence, could have a further period off the road, 5 years down to 18 months for various different offences. And remember that this is retrospective as well as into the future. So there is people out there at the moment who are driving taxis who will have their licence suspended or fully taken away. It's the first time it's been done in the history of the state. And, it is very, very necessary.
Tell us about the Demerit system. This is a kind of penalty point system that is being put in place for other taxi drivers to try and improve the general standard of service. What exactly qualifies as a demerit, and how many strikes are you allowed?
Well, what it is effectively a penalty point system. If a taxi driver breaches a regulation at the moment, they get a fine. The fines are now going to be graduated. Some of them are going to actually be decreased. I think it's not fair for certain taxi drivers to be getting large fines because their back wheels are on the double yellow lines, etc. But there is, increases in other areas. So effectively, if a taxi driver takes you the scenic route, or doesn't provide information to regulatory authorities, doesn't maintain certain standards, has issues with fares, the various different issues in relation to where they stand for hire, they will get demerits, which are penalty points. And if you get 8 demerits, your licence will be suspended for 3 years. And the policy here is to try and ensure that taxi drivers adhere to a certain standard, and they know there's a consequence if they repeatedly breach regulations.
Who determines the scenic route? Who gets into the cab and has brought the extra 4 or 5 miles? I mean, are you going to have undercover agents pretending they're tourists?
Well, 2 things about that. Firstly, I do plan on ensuring that there is greater enforcement. I've worked closely with the Gardaí, and this legislation will also allow us to bring in extra resources to enforce the industry, which I think is necessary. But to answer your question directly, it's the public. The public makes complaints. The NTA, National Transport Authority, who have authority in this area, will investigate the complaints, and if they're upheld, then the driver will get demerit.